So we'll start in about a minute or two. We're just waiting for a technical glitch to be fixed. We'll just feel like a pilot on a plane that's waiting to take off, and we've been told that air traffic control has held you for a few more minutes. So, can any of you sing?
I was promised karaoke. It's like, but apparently it isn't on the program.
Okay, well, why don't we start? I think that we're just waiting for the a video to be uploaded in a second. So when we proposed a topic on procurement, especially on late in the afternoon, we wondered who's going to come. But I'm so happy that you're all here because procurement isn't often a topic that's on top of people's minds. But as we know, to get anything done at all, governments, international organizations, even private firms uh, have to procure goods and services. Uh, and because they can't possibly do everything internally. Thus, procurement has the potential to impact development effectiveness of almost everything the government does, policies, projects. And effective procurement systems not only ensure that goods and services are received at least cost, but that they also actually help you deliver development outcomes. Thus, this topic really is central, actually, to the issue of all the things we've been talking about, certainly about resilience and sustainability, because anything that government does to promote that has to be procured. Uh, it's also a material to inclusive partnerships, because, as we know, especially when there's development assistance involved, procurement systems aren't always aligned. And the concerns of donors and those who receive foreign assistance are sometimes at odds with each other. The donors are very concerned, and rightly so, because they're accountable to their taxpayers, as we saw yesterday, to make sure that all the money is accounted for and spent well. Those who receive assistance are very concerned that the development assistance is often very much delayed as a result of procurement. I remember when we were doing the procurement evaluation that hopefully we will show in a minute the results of very quickly. The executive director from one of our countries wanted to have a meeting to talk about his concerns. And he had his office bring a pile literally of documents this high and said, here, this is what we have to absorb in order for us to receive your assistance. How can this be improved? The other concern that they have is that in winning bids, many of the firms in developing member countries feel that they are at a disadvantage. Certainly in some developed countries, you have big firms who have huge departments that know how to bid. And especially in countries with relatively capacity, it's simply, even though it's supposed to be a level playing field, they feel that the playing field is not so level. So inclusive partnerships of how to align these two issues is very much of concern. The third theme of the conference is innovation. And because these concerns are not new and are well known to these institutions, there have been attempts to try to address these concerns. And we're very pleased that we have a panel here that actually reflects different perspectives on these important questions, on how to address the concerns and what are the innovations that have taken place. And in the spirit of inclusive partnerships, we have included, very importantly, someone from government, from a developing member country, who is perhaps often at the receiving end, but also a country that actually procures a lot of things. So it'd be very interesting to hear from Avinash Dash, Director, Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office of Niti Aayog of Government of India. Niti Aayog is the premier, I guess, think tank, if you may, that serves the Government of India and was formerly the Planning Commission of India. We have someone who has been engaged with this issue from the UN system. So very pleased to have Sumi Rao, who had the shortest commute of anyone on the panel, since she just lives down the street, working for the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or UN ESCAP. And she's been engaged in the region on these issues of helping country to make development assistance more efficient and delivering and more timely. And finally, we have Jeff Chelsky, who is the manager, as for those of you who were here earlier, was on the panel of the Economic Management and Country Programs Unit of the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. What I wanted to do was to start off the session with a clip from my colleague, Yoonji Kim, who has just done an evaluation of ADB's procurement reforms. And what I'd like to know is if G is now available online yet. Get the thumbs up. We're now cleared for takeoff.
My name is Eunji Kim, the lead for the evaluation of ADB's procurement. Hello, my name is Eunji Kim, the lead for the evaluation of ADB's procurement system. This corporate evaluation focused on the initial implementation of the new procurement policy framework between 2014 and 2021. These are some of the key reform goals of ADB's procurement policy framework. First, it aimed to and to do so by modernizing and consolidating its practices and policies into a more unified one. The new framework introduced two new core principles: quality and value for money, while fostering the use of more fit-for-purpose procurement for its client countries. PPF also focused on achieving better governance through improved accountability, integrity, avoidance of conflict of interests, and response to procurement-related complaints. As a result, ADB has achieved the following under the PPF. First was the modernization of its operational procedures, and by late 2021, it had developed or updated 26 guidance notes on procurement. Next was the Strategic Procurement Planning, or SPP, which was adopted to help ADB and DMCs better identify the relative risk and importance of various procurement packages. Third was the Procurement Capacity Development Support, which was vital for effective implementation of the reforms. Since 2017, over 300 ADB staffs were newly accredited or renewed their past accreditations, while more than 7,300 DMC officials received procurement training. Next was the outposting of procurement specialists to resident missions and regional departments, meant to minimize the communication gap and distance between ADB and its client. But as of late 2021, only 11 were in resident missions, while 13 were strategically placed within ADB headquarters. ADB has also started modernizing its procurement data management systems. Since 2017, it launched 3 IT systems, one of which, the Integrated Disbursement System, was long overdue, as it replaced a 40-year-old mainframe-based system. The last was on improving procurement efficiency. Evaluation found that while ADB succeeded in reducing its portion of procurement processing time quite consistently each year since 2017, the DMCs could not. These are the challenges encountered in carrying out the procurement reforms. First, key concepts, such as value for money, are not clearly communicated nor incorporated into ADB's corporate results framework. Next, the procurement risk was assessed based on contract size, as ADB used a size-based threshold that did not account for the fact that the most critical contract in a procurement package is not always among the largest. Third challenge is the adoption of strategic procurement planning, or SPP, among the client countries, which depended on their existing procurement capacity. So many inexperienced DMCs resorted to using planning reports written by external consultants, resulting in minimal transfer of procurement capacity. Next, many DMCs could not adopt or take full advantage of the PPF due to the high bar of entry, more so if their own regulations were risk averse. Fifth was the lack of an internal capacity development strategy, which resulted in insufficient capacity development, incentivization, and integration of ADB staff for procurement. Another challenge was the insufficient planning and coordination for DMC capacity development support. As such, interventions were usually included as one-off regional workshops or as a part of TA support. Finally, many of ADB's data-related systems and processes remain heavily dependent on time-intensive manual input, resulting in errors and inefficiencies. An overall data management strategy is needed to improve procurement data transparency and governance. Finally, these are the recommendations from the evaluation. First, clearly message and better communicate key procurement principles and objectives. Second, prioritize and manage procurement contracts not only by size, but also by how critical they are to project success. Third, strengthen the transparency and governance of procurement by further improving procurement data system design, integration, and management. Fourth, commit strategic long-term investments to continue building on current initiatives to develop procurement capacity of both ADB and the DMCs. Finally, promote interdepartmental collaboration to ensure that SPP is an integrated and holistic practice that considers quality and value for money, including wider social and economic objectives and sustainable procurement. Thank you for your attention, and if you would like to read more, the report can be found on ADB's webpage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, G. We'd clap for you, except you couldn't hear us. So, panel, you heard about the ADB evaluation study. I'd like to start off with a question for each of you, just very quickly, from your own institutions and your own perspectives, what are the two most pressing challenges on procurement that you'd like to share with our audience? So I'll start with you, Jeff.
So, thank you, Manny. The two things that jump out at me are things that also actually resonate more broadly in some other evaluative work we've done. One is the integrating procurement into a broader public financial management structure. We have done several evaluations on public financial and debt management and found very similar findings to the ADB, and a lot of it has to do with the difficulty in taking something like procurement and integrating it into country strategies from the standpoint of capacity building and prioritization. We see similar problems with other aspects. Public investment management, for example, also has similar problems, and I think there's probably some common solutions that one might look into. The second is the whole area of human resources. I mean, we talk about capacity building. This dovetails into issues of public sector reform and how human resources are managed. We know what the constraints are: poorly paid public servants, turnover, et cetera, and we, in many ways, keep doing the same kinds of capacity building and end up with the same lack of retention. And I believe that the recommendation from the ADB evaluation is that we need, rather than intensive short bursts of training, but a longer-term perspective. And I think that's where we're going to find part of the answer.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Sumi, you sort of wear two hats. One is, of course, UNSCAP provides a lot of advice to countries themselves, and so it would be good for you to tell us a little bit about what you've been told by them, what is their biggest procurement challenge, but also if there are any procurement challenges within the UN system itself that you'd like to share. So just a couple of those would be great.
Thank you very much, Manny, and I'm glad that we managed to take off on time so that I didn't have to start with the singing in the karaoke first. But jokes aside, we could actually, from the UN Secretariat or even the UNSCAP, which is in fully alignment with the corporate strategic direction of the procurement processes or the evaluation. Many we align, and several challenges and opportunities are being shared with the ADB discovery and also with the World Bank perspective. One thing that I just remember what Manny said, from whether it's from the Secretariat perspective or even in the UN Common System, we do have the SG has announced the management reform, which actually took the very issue to reform the procurement and the HR back in the 2019. Then followed by the development reform, which obviously we are now talking about how can we reduce the duplication, but going into common services solutions with the UN system entities, even to cooperate with World Bank and ADB. And obviously that's the push from our member state, wanting us to bring the results. And the challenge that we have now is, I think we are quite good in moving from rules-based procurement to risk-based, and we are now aiming for a solution-based or the results-based or even impacts-based. Very quickly, what that means is we want to go beyond the measuring the timeline or the speed or the quality or the best value for money, but can we utilize and leverage the procurement process to be the enabler, even to implement inclusive procurement, and even the disability inclusion aspect of the UN values framework that we all commonly share in the final procurement results based. So those are the kind of challenges that we are facing. And the last point, which I completely agree with what Jeff said, was the challenge that we are still addressing ongoing is the capacity building of our human resources, particularly in the procurement officers. How do we professionalize them? But also, we have duly noted with a criticality that there are more than procurement officials in the procurement process outcome. So the real capacity building also needs to come into the demand generation, which is actually starting from the substantive divisions, program divisions, sometimes even from the donor countries in terms of reaching the final fit-for-purpose, impact-based results. So those are kind of challenges we are navigating at the moment.
Thanks a lot, Sumi. Avinash, you have a distinct perspective from government, and could you share with us from Niti Aayog and your experience, what are the procurement challenges with government, and also what are your frustrations with the donors?
Yeah, so very rightly put. So the thing is that procurement from the government side is actually the first and foremost is the value for money. That can be for any procurement process, and that is not exclusive for public procurement, but it's more so when we are dealing with public money. So the three things which we should be actually focusing while we look for procurement, better procurement processes and reforms, is basically transparency, efficiency, and accountability. So accountability, improving accountability is one of the more core principles of public procurement. And in India, we have been actually doing that, so reforming the public procurement process and making it more and more accessible to the public, more and more people who can actually bid for the works, for the goods, and for the services. That is how we categorized it. And specifically coming to the M&E, because this is an M&E forum, so we actually are dealing with the challenges of procurement of services, and especially the consulting services. And consulting services are typically like driven by not similar ways like goods and other non-consulting services. It's driven by the type and quality of work which you are expecting from them, and many a times you need the results, like agility we were talking about yesterday. So there also we need to like produce evaluations reports which are like kind of to be consumed in a very short period of time, demanded in a very short period of time. And you know, the procurement process, it takes a whole lot of time. If you and you cannot just spend money unless you put similar procedures for short-term procurement. And that is one of the frustration is of now, is like how to be actually transparent, accountable, and also efficient. So that is where we have actually built in, maybe I can come later, how we developed a system of kind of a critical kind, we put in a procurement the size, and below that size we can actually reduce the amount of layers which you go through, and so the kind of enabling the procurement process, making it faster and efficient. I will hold there. And
No, thanks a lot,
yeah.
Avinash, and thank you for sharing the results of your own assessment of for the procurement system. Jeff, I know that the World Bank is doing one such an assessment. I was wondering if you could share with us some early results.
So the task leader for this evaluation insisted that I refer to everything I'm saying as early emerging preliminary tentative findings. I believe the intention is to have this published by the late spring, perhaps as late as June. What was interesting is when I met with them to talk about emerging findings, I went back and read the evaluation of procurement that IEG did in 2014. And that led to a big procurement reform in 2016. What is a little disturbing is that a lot of those findings are exactly the same findings in the ADB evaluation, and they are the emerging findings in the new evaluation. And on one hand, one wonders if it's because we didn't do the right thing, or these problems are just so intractable that the solution is still evading us. But let me give you a sense of some of the surprising things that jumped out at me. So the bank introduced this thing called STEP, the Systematic Tracking of Exchanges in Procurement. Now, this was supposed to be the sort of the monitoring tool. The problem is that countries are taking up to 50% of their time uploading documents. What this means is the documents are not getting uploaded, which means the data is in there. So its ability to use this tool for monitoring, for signaling, is undermined. And there's a recognition in these findings that what was needed and what will be needed is a much more simplified approach. I guess there's a tendency to bring the Cadillac when what you really need is the VW Golf. And I used to have a VW Golf, so I'm very fond of them. And so if I still had it, I would offer it up. But it's realizing that a system that does everything is probably not going to do very much for a lot of countries, particularly lower capacity countries. And in fact, I think the expression that the task team leader uses is it doesn't produce actionable information, but it has everything in it if you could actually upload the documents. What was interesting on the HR side, and this is the capacity building side, there were some bright lights and some good practices, and I think part of it is a recognition that public services are very difficult to reform. And they cited in Liberia, where you actually have, it's a financial, let me make sure I get it's a financial management training institute in the university. Now, this is not going to solve your problem, but what it does is it produces a pipeline of potential people who are trained. And I think training outside of the context of people in the public service has some benefits because they have not necessarily been influenced by the incentive structure. It also, from their standpoint, it's a way into the public service. If they can get in, they're cheap. And you can have more of them than in fact, trying to reform the existing structure. That was something that was found to be useful. The evaluation mirrors the finding about prioritizing procurement not because of its size, but because of its criticality. And we saw a lot of that in some work we did on project implementation units, where simple things like the consultants to set things up are not there, and the whole thing gets slowed down because we haven't done this. This is not really expensive stuff, but because it isn't prioritized, you end up with a huge delay because you don't even have the basic people in place at the beginning. So that's something that we found that was similar. And I guess the other good practice that was identified is coming out of COVID, interestingly enough, and that's sharing of procurement documents across countries where you have technical specifications that are replicable. And in the case of COVID, a lot of the health equipment that was needed, the actual procurement officer wouldn't necessarily understand that, but it was the same thing that was needed everywhere. And so there was a network of sharing that was happening that was very helpful. The point about country strategies and integrating capacity building into country strategies, this is something that we're going to talk about more broadly at a session tomorrow on building resilience. And we find this in the whole public financial management space, where you've got really good diagnostics about what needs to be fixed, but they are not produced at the right time, so they're not available to inform country strategies. They tend not to be as high profile as some other issues, so they don't get the attention they need to get. They are often, let's say, as I said, it's not integrated into the broader public financial management space. And there, things like public investment management, we find, are neglected enormously. It's actually interesting to me that the institution that has taken the lead on public investment management is the IMF, not the World Bank. The main diagnostic tool is produced by the IMF, which makes you wonder what the incentive structure is that's underpinning this. So a lot of this is coming out. We're doing some work also on the use of project implementation units generally, and what's quite surprising to me is how little we know about something so important. There is very little evaluative work. I think there's something actually the ADB did on good practice in the use of PIUs, but it strikes me that there's an interface with the procurement issue that's worth looking into.
Thanks, Jeff, and noted on the fact that this is a very early tentative set of findings. Avinash, and then I'll turn to you as well, Sumi. I mean, the issue of capacity development is a vexing one across all the things that we deal with in development, but one that's really important and for procurement seems to be especially salient. So, Avinash, any good practices that you found from Niti Aayog that might work well in terms of building long-term capacity on something that is quite complex?
Yeah. Basically, it's a like of Niti Aayog or anybody else in government for public procurement. There is this gem called Government E-Marketplace. That is the public procurement platform for all the departments which comes under the union government. So, and it was established in 2016, and about 1 trillion rupee or $13 billion is the amount of procurement done in last 5 years. And the cost saving is like 20% reduction in the cost which used to do earlier and after the coming of the GEM portal. And from the office stationaries to the evaluation consultancy services, you can procure anything. And that's the most beauty of this GEM platform, is that it is transparent, open, and your bids are actually driven by the time and the amount of, as Jeff was also saying, and you were also saying, that the uploading and other things, they have been actually quite made simple, so that, and for each departments there will be a dedicated professional which will be assigned from the GEM, and who will be actually hand-holding each department's bidding process. And they will not only help in the capacity building process, they will be actually hand-holding the departments in actually uploading the bids and receiving the bids. So this is an ongoing capacity building which has been done by the GEM for all the departments concerned. So there will be a nodal officer for each of the department, and they will be actually doing this for like longer period of time, for about 6 months, so that they can start doing on their own. So that's one of the beautiful innovation that has taken place.
Great, thanks. So this issue of continuous engagement by a dedicated person over a longer period of time is very interesting. Sumi?
From our side of the Secretary, I think there are two very important capacity building initiatives that I can share. One from the internal secretariat, UN secretary perspective. So our procurement typical volume is about 3 billion a year in annual basis. And then there are about like 25 different procurement offices across the global secretariat entities. And we were very much of the centralization until the 2019, meaning most of the global long-term contracts were administered and managed by the headquarter personnel, and very little delegated authority was given to these disparate offices in the field offices. What that meant was that there was the big push also from the member states where why are we having such a long process for the procurement outcome that requires a closer decision making at the delivery points. So the management reform of the UN Secretariat as a whole in 2019 was actually the response to that. But however, that came also with the challenges. Is our human resources ready for such decentralization approach? And also the decentralization is a great news, but it also spells immediate risk increase of the importance of the regulations and rules and the public sector, where our 193 member states that governs the Secretariat reasonably should be worried of this decentralization approach overnight. So the two-track approach that we have undertaken for now has been the professionalization program for the procurement officials. So we have actually, signed an agreement with the CIPS. It's like a CPA version of the procurement sector, administered in UK, and also some other equivalent kind of a professional license program that every procurement official has to complete, which is like almost the deadline is actually this year. And then we have an internal procurement training campus, online campus, where we also benefited from the pandemic experience that we can actually do a lot of this on the online program as well. Then the second tier that I want to share is the current common procurement or the common service solutions efforts that, in fact, I'm actually the co-chair in the regional operational management team with the UN common system entities in the Asia Pacific region, where we are trying to identify where can we actually stop duplicating the common procurement contracts if it is of something that we can actually all share. And that requires two culture change. One is we all have this notion that my regulations rules are superior to yours. And although all our important big bosses have signed off on the mutual recognition in principle, we still haven't operationalized it. And we have also realized through this community of practice efforts that it is even difficult to find one repository system where you can find all of these LTAs that the UN Common System can tap onto. So we are taking slow but definite steps to go towards this, removing the barriers and looking at, and I'm one of the board members in the Secretariat to review the processes change and the policy changes on the procurement processes that will actually reduce the barrier of doing more and more of the common services solutions, and also even in the capacity building of the procurement officials. So let me stop there.
That's interesting across the UN system, how there seems to be this tension. But Jeff, the World Bank, I know, since I still remember my days there, did decentralize about 20 years ago, where it was like the UN system, very, very centralized, and then it gave a lot of authority to countries. Any lessons that you think on how the World Bank managed this process and still managed the risks that a lot of people were concerned about if you delegated authority to the country level?
So I'm going to speculate a little bit. I think when you decentralize and you shift the responsibility to lower levels, unless you've got a management structure that is going to protect those people from taking risks, it's not going to work. Because they will become, and in fact, I believe the ADB evaluation talks about, it's box checking. There's a complete risk aversion, and people are rational. So someone can give you the responsibility to make all these decisions, but if you feel that if you make a mistake, you're going to be dragged on the carpet and no one is going to protect you, you're not going to use any of that responsibility. And I think we've all probably at some point in our lives experienced management structures where something goes wrong and they look for a scapegoat. And the scapegoats usually are found fairly low down the totem pole. So.
Well, I'm shocked that happens, Jeff. Avinash, any experiences from India on, you have quite a large number of states, a lot of authority delegated even down to the district level, and what are the concerns at the union level of some of the issues on procurement?
Yeah, so basically there is decentralized procurement. So state levels procurement is governed by the state level financial rules, while the union government is actually governed by the general financial rules of the central government, which is 2017 which came. And there is a manual for procurement also describing each and every rule of how the procurement process works and what are the rules, because the main rule book is not that large. So there it's a kind of explanatory book, which is the manual, which explains stepwise how the procurement has to be done, what are the steps, how do you do it. But I would like to share one case is like when we are doing procurement, especially for the taking up studies for evaluation, outsourcing them, and so which we have found that once we are trying to go through the general financial rules through the open market, that is anybody can be bidding in the process, that is actually a lengthy process, and because of the processes laid down in the rule book, and you can't actually go against the book. So that actually takes about 3 to 6 months for onboarding any consultant firms for undertaking the evaluation study for you. So what we have done is like empanelment of institutions, and the threshold limit is like $3 million, and for small size studies, and that has been actually increased to $6 million for Niti Aayog on the request of Niti Aayog that we are doing a lot of evaluation studies, so please increase this limit for us. And the Department of Expenditure actually agreed to it, because most of the evaluation studies are done by Niti Aayog as a third party evaluator. The ministries and any of the ministry in the central government are free to get it done through their own, but it is also they can be conducted, they can request Niti Aayog to conduct it for them. So these smaller size studies, which is basically also we talked about evaluations, how big, how rigorous, how diagnostic, how formative evaluation, what kind of evaluation we are trying to do. So they basically, when we go for such smaller kind of procurement issues, procurement proposals, then we mostly limit ourselves to the diagnostic studies. And if we are going for a larger sample size like 50,000 households and 200 plus 300 plus FGDs and key informant interviews, then we go for an open tender and bigger size procurement process, which is by its very nature lengthy, but that has its advantages also, and some as you were saying, some frustration with the timing also. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Jeff and Sumi, I wonder if you could reflect on what Sumi mentioned. You mentioned that in the UN system, it's not necessarily coordinated what the procurement processes are. And I know certainly countries must be frustrated if they have not just one, two, but maybe 10 donors, each of which have their own systems, that if there's one pile for one donor, there are multiple piles of documents that have to be uploaded. Some people have suggested that perhaps if you have a system that seems to be working well, like a country like India, that we rely not on individual institutional systems, but the country system itself to make it easier for them. Any thoughts on this? Jeff first, and then Sumi.
Let me draw on the work we've done on PIUs more generally. And there, I think you go back to the Paris Agreement, and we were supposed to do away with these, and everything was supposed to be using country systems. We seem to have a hybrid situation where we still have PIUs, but they're staffed by government government workers. There, I guess the important thing is ensuring that you do have the continuity, because you've got a learning curve, you get people up the learning curve. And I think where country systems can be used, they are being used. I think the real challenges are where the country systems can't be relied on. And that's where we see the biggest challenge on the capacity side.
Sumi, any reflections?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and I think we are still navigating, but I want to give like one example, which is our ongoing challenges that we are navigating with the support of our member states' understanding. So we have, when we actually had to undergo this management reform, which completely called for the less centralization, which was unthinkable in the Secretariat a decade ago, it actually meant that we looked at our internal processes of what is going on. And we found that it became a very prescriptive procurement manual, and also very, very prescriptive delegation of authority of the procurement threshold, because it was based on the fear-based and the risk-based. So when there was one procurement scandal, or not even going into scandal, but if there's one procurement mistake that occurred, then the immediate reaction from the Secretariat in the past was to add another layer, or we have add another auditors. So I used to be, before I came to the shortest commuting distance here, I used to be working in New York, heading the procurement service, and I had 225 audit recommendations a year, meaning that even if I implement every day, I can't beat it. And I think that required our collective reform spirit, not only on the procurement officials or the related officials doing the procurement processes, but even our auditors, whether it's our internal auditors, our external board of auditors from the government, but also our JIU, who looks at the overall UN system as to why we are not doing less duplication. So that was a lot of culture change that we are still navigating. And one of the big efforts that we are actually doing these days is the simplification of the processes. For example, one achievement that we did this year was actually we just pressed off, hot off the press, that we actually circulated across the Global Secretariat procurement officers of the harmonization of the procurement thresholds. So whether you are 10 years experienced procurement officers working in the Bangui in the conflict zone, whether you are in New York, whether you are in Bangkok, you have the same procurement threshold. Meaning we found that in a very prescriptive, different variances of the thresholds is very prone to mistakes. Sometimes I had to look for my own delegated authority threshold to check on a different, and our procurement manual pages became 258 pages, and our auditors were looking at the manual, and our procurement officials themselves were looking at the manual as if it's a Bible or the Quran. So we are doing that kind of the culture change, that really going into the professionalization of that, but also soliciting the support from our donor countries and the member states, who at times, when they come to review and audit and evaluate secretariat processes, they are tougher with us compared to when the same donor countries go into other UN system entity, they become a little bit more lenient. So we are also doing this collective 360 degree of the culture change to get to the common agenda.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, then I'm going to turn to the floor. But one question that I had is, part of the culture change, as you saw in my colleague G's report, was this shift from what is seemingly, even despite the large number of documents that are required, a simple objective, which is least cost. So lowest bidder, go for it. Seems like a simple enough. Now we're shifting to what we call value for money. And I was just wondering if you could reflect on the challenges for that you now have to not only look at the cost side, which is perhaps a little bit more transparent, but what are the benefits that you're getting from the procurement of the goods? And in your case, Avinash, the procurement of consulting services. Is it good enough? What does that mean, value for money? So I was just wondering if you could reflect on that. Jeff first.
Yeah, I was actually a little overwhelmed when I saw all of the criteria that the new procurement framework in the World Bank was supposed to follow. It's like there were 8 of them. A value for money, I mean, it of course makes intuitive sense, but I'll be honest, we don't know how to measure it. We don't know how to. One of the problems identified with STEP is it wasn't producing actionable data. I mean, on something like this, how do you, I mean, there's so many ways, then it is not an objective concept. It's a subjective concept. I think we have to realize the limitations of that, because that means there's a lot more judgment involved. And if you don't have capacity, you're not going to get that judgment exercise. So I think we need to adapt the concepts to the reality that we're dealing with, rather than pick the best concept and hope that we can bring incentives and capacity into alignment with it.
Okay, I'm not sure I quite got the gist of that, but we'll come back. Sumi, over to you.
Right. I think this concept of the best value for money for the Secretariat was about actually after our procurement scandal about a decade ago, and then that's where we actually moved on to the results-based procurement. So we stopped looking at just the lowest cost, but we looked at what is the substantially compliant outcome, particularly looking at the concept called total cost of ownership. So one very practical example, we used to have a generator in the peacekeeping or the conflict zones that we actually bought. We bought it as goods, and through the invitation to bid, meaning that we knew what we want. And then we look at only the fail or pass criteria, and then we based it on the lowest cost outcome. What that meant to us in the impact when we actually measured the actual cost of ownership of once we bought that was that we spent a lot more cost in maintaining it when the goods didn't meet our needs, and when it starts to break down, and when it also created a reputational damages of creating the environmental footprint in a negative way. So what we moved towards the BVM concept was we started looking for solution-driven concept using request for proposal, and we didn't specify what we want, but we only specified the criteria, and then we started evaluating the actual cost of owning that on the 5-year scale or so. And we also evaluated not only the maintenance and after service kind of concept, but we also evaluated the actual cost of training our personnel on the ground managing this equipment. And many times in the Secretariat, we have like our troops that are actually managing these generators who are not necessarily skilled in the engineering for that. So we started doing that, which resulted in us obtaining the completely different outcome. And we now, when we have less and less of the goods, but we have more services contracts.
Thank you.
Yeah, so basically, if we look at procurement of services and also goods, it's actually a balancing act. So one thing is like we have been doing L1 based, that is the least cost. So least cost is always preferred like for routine services and goods procurement, which you have been doing for many years. So for that, you go for kind of least cost whoever comes, because that you know what kind of material you are looking for. But generally, when again I will come back to services, consulting services. That's the difficult part. So hiring that, you need also assessment of quality. So we actually moved from L1 to QCBS, which is actually quality adjusted, and it's kind of, it can be 90-10, 80-20, 70-30, and the most 70, 80, 90 being on quality, and the lesser on the cost aspect. So basically they bid and they submit two envelopes. One is their technical bids and the other one is the financial bids. And as you know, those who qualify the technical, their financial bids are opened. So based on the quality we are looking for, we put more emphasis on the quality. And most of these jobs are like, if we are for consulting services, getting evaluations done, then they require good quality firm, and not only firm, they also require quality and experienced people who will be actually leading this team. Then again, why I told it's a balancing act, because based on our experience, we see that if we've become very restrictive and very prescriptive in the kind of like what kind of project you would have done in the past, and what are the people with so many experience, with so many eligible assignments and everything, if we become very prescriptive, then we get lesser number of bids, which is actually counterproductive. So even if we are trying to make our jobs, even our jobs become difficult if we prescribe more, because we have more evaluation criteria to fulfill and check for. So it is easier to like say that if you would have done anything related to socio-economic evaluation in last 5 years with 100 households, then it's easy. But if we go and prescribe more and more, as we add on the kind of qualifications, we increase our work. At the same time, we don't get enough bids. So that is why we are trying to balance, and at the same time not bringing people who do not have wherewithal to actually perform. That also happened. So it's a kind of balancing act which we are trying to make a kind of reach a fine balance.
That's great. Can you just share an example for us of how you assess quality?
Yeah. So for assessment of quality, so one is the firm. So at two levels the quality is assessed. One is at the firm level, and one is at the individual personal level. To those who will be performing, like the team lead or the sub team, then other technical professionals who we need for the conducting the evaluation. So for the firm, it will be first will be the turnover. How much turnover they have in last maybe 3 audited financial years. Secondly, whether they have done similar project in the past of the same size and of dealing with the same kind of evaluations which we are looking for. If it is an organizational evaluation, have they done any evaluation for any other organization similarly placed? If it is a household, if we are trying to do a pan-India study for about 100 lakh households, then we would be at least looking for somebody who have done 50,000 households. And then again, if they have published the reports, then whether the earlier those who have actually given them assignments give a feedback, get a free feedback from them, informal feedback from them. So these are the ways through which the firm's quality is assessed. Similarly, for individuals, they are also the parameters are the same, whether they have handled similar size of, but at the individual level, of course, it will be lesser as compared to the firm. Individually, he would have handled might have not dealt such a huge project on his own, because it would be difficult. It would be a firm, and he will be sharing the responsibility. So there, the onerous, it's not that onerous, but on the firm, it is quality is a bit, higher.
No, thanks very much. It's very important to have that granular feel for how this is being done. So we have some time for questions, comments. Please just raise your hand and try to direct it to the appropriate panelist if your question is for one person. Yes, please. Again, please identify yourselves.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very lively discussion. Situation influences the notion. I'm an external auditor, so I want to talk more on the perspective of external audit. Yeah, when it comes to the external audit of these projects, interventions, development projects, so on and so forth. At the moment, almost all the donors include as a requirement for assurance, in addition to providing an opinion on the financial statement, also compliance, either an opinion or maybe a statement about how far the PMU has complied with the procurement, guidelines or rules of the development partner. I mean the donor. Yeah. I'm just wondering, wouldn't we also include in the contracts with the PMU, with the implementing agency, that they should also carry out a performance audit maybe sometime after implementation of the project, yeah? And also taking into account ESG, the fourth E, right? Now we talk about 3 E's, economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. In addition to that, why not the fourth E we should consider and include, like equity? How far the project help improve the social status of the people? How far does it actually serve the best interests of the society in which it's implemented, yeah?
Thank you. There's a question here.
Thank you. I am also auditor. I am from Nepal. I am only concerned about, not question, I am providing the suggestions only, because we have, as an auditor, there is no harmonization between procurement system of ADB, World Bank, EU, USAID, so many partners. Some project has pool funding. Auditor is confused which procurement rule should be followed, because we have our national procurement system and donor-wise different procurement system. So I suggest that the procurement system should be harmonized. Then we can use harmonized procurement system. About the regulation, standard bidding documents, also there are so many difference between standard bidding documents. So harmonization is mostly needed, one thing. Our procurement system is developed on the recommendation of ADB and World Bank. ADB and World Bank has recommended the procurement law, procurement document, all the systems of government of Nepal. But they are not using that system, because we have electronic procurement system, so many provisions that is developed by World Bank and ADB, but they are not using that system. So I request, if you have recommended that system to our system, you have to also adopt that system if there is some deficiencies, and then you can suggest that this deficiency is in your system, so you have to request. And other thing, for globally, FIDIC is system, but it is most costly, because FIDIC documents are not easily available in website. Other training for FIDIC is so costly. Persons like from Nepal, we cannot afford the training cost of the FIDIC training. So I request you to provide FIDIC training to developing countries, because it is globally practiced. So this is my not question, it is only suggestion about harmonization, using, and capacity development. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we start with those? And it wasn't, even if it wasn't a question, I'm sure you might have something to say about harmonization, but also I think a very important point about the ESG and on the value side and how that should be reflected. So Sumi, can I start with you? And
Sure. And I pardon whatever I said about the external auditors, if there was any negative notion. But I'm really glad that we actually have the external auditors here, because I think that should be the dialogue that we should actually be engaging more and more. So just on the harmonization, I fully agree. Even the pain points of the auditors of when external auditors are evaluating whether it's ADB or World Bank or the Secretariat, like which procurement regulations and rules and which financial regulations rules we actually reviewing at the moment. I also find that the one size does not fit all. And while we will all aspire towards it, personally, I don't think we can actually achieve the utopian world where the one FRR or one procurement rules that will govern the entire procurement offices in the system, whether in the public sector, because in the UN context, for example, we do have a slightly variance in the mandated deliveries and different nature of the actual program requirements, whether it's like a UN SCOP, like Regional Commission, or whether it's a humanitarian agency in UNHCR or WFP, or whether it's some of the more secretariat offices where we require a very stringent processes that governs it. However, I think the virtue is that we recognize that one size does not fit all, and we also recognize the importance of contextualizing depending on the mandated deliveries and also in the regional perspective as well. One example, in the Secretariat, when we had to address the emergency situations of earthquake in Haiti, or in the conflict situations or evacuation requirements in peacekeeping, or in the development sector in, for example, Asia Pacific, we couldn't use the one standard procurement process that governs the development sector to be applied to the emergency procurement. However, I think the importance is how do we actually make sure that there are the robust system that attending to when is a outcome necessary for the emergency procurement to be done, but at least strike the right balance that this is not something that we are skipping all the rules and the important public sector for the mandated requirements and the public sector reputational aspect. And I think that's, and also another thing is how that stemmed us to look at is we had to simplify our own procurement manual for the practitioners, but also the auditors to look at on the different context of the situations, but also, going back to the capacity building, whether our resources are able to actually deliver according to this situation. One aspect we are actually pushing a lot these days is let's not try to go after people after they go mistake or determining whether they are the right person doing it, but let's start it at the HR level, meaning when we are actually recruiting our procurement professionals. That should be the stage where we actually should have a comfort factor whether this person is fit for doing the work. Then I think then all of our simplification, harmonization of the shorter procurement thresholds page or the manuals will have the trust factor from the donors that we actually have the right people to do the right delivery. So those are kind of things that we are looking at the moment. And one aspect also is we are pushing for the mobility. What that means in the practical terms. My personal example, I started off as an engineer in the peacekeeping. Then, because I was so fed up with the procurement, I was so fed up with the buyers, I moved to the procurement division. Then I was so fed up with our review authorities in the Secretariat called headquarters review authorities who look at this procurement process undertaken. So I joined to be the special advisor to the Assistant Secretary General who oversees these 3 areas. Then now after sort of like getting the right balance, I'm now as an administrator in Asia Pacific who look at facilities, IT, procurement, local review committee, and how I can no longer also complain about the other UN system entities because I'm supposed to be coordinating our common efforts. And I think that mobility aspect actually will go far away in creating that harmonization and to reduce the differences.
No, great. No, thank you very much, and also your personal experience. And I think you remind us that procurement is not just a task of procurement specialists, but that everyone has to know at least a little bit about procurement. Even the task managers who are actually the specialists leading the projects, enough to know whom to ask. Avinash, over to you and some reflections on the questions.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So I have, like, I am an evaluator, and we also have to do a lot of procurement process. So it's like learning on the job. So and it's actually fascinating, and because it's you cannot separate it altogether. Both have to know the constraints in which the other one is working, and also has to appreciate it the way it should be. So coming back to the auditors' questions, actually, so and comments. So actually, India has actually taken steps with regard to adding the equity aspect. So we already following the OECD DAC criteria, where we have the relevance and the two E's: effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability. But at the same time, we have like kind of added the equity perspective, because equity is a major thing which India is looking into and always trying to improve upon, because of the high levels of inequality which is being reduced over a period of time. So that is in the terms of gender inequality, reducing the gap, the social inequality, and also the regional inequality. So these are the things which actually through these innovations and also reforms in the process which we have brought. One reform is MSME reforms, is like bringing in the procurement process the MSME who can actually bid, who will not be in the same platform as with the big firms. So for them, actually, there are special provisions. They do not have to like submit the equal amount of earnest money or like the other bid documents. So there are relaxations with regard to MSME sector. And so there are other kind of harmonization. I'm not the right person, but it seems a good idea, harmonizing, but depends on like in Government of India. So if you go for procurement, and if it is a World Bank funded project or ADB funded project, they will be following those procurement manuals only. So if it is a government procurement, we follow the government procurement manual. So it's kind of divided there only, and you have to follow those rules and regulations. And harmonizing these documents, I have no answer. So to yeah, and basically what I would like going forward is use of technology and IT is has to be kind of leveraged. Uh, because IT reducing, it's been the Indian experience, reducing human interface is bringing more transparency, and that is can be done through more and more bringing more and more IT involvement in the procurement process. Yeah.
Thanks. Maybe we'll come back to that in a second. But first, I wanted to get Jeff's perspective, especially on either the harmonization or the equity point.
Harmonization. I'm not sure I can contribute anything meaningful to that, but I did want to say something about the issue of the cost of capacity building has come up. So in the evaluation we're working on, there's all sorts of models that we're looking at. The bank has something called HICE, Hands-on Expanded Implementation Support.
Terrible acronym.
I kid you not. I was reading the operational guidance, and the notion is you get usually an international consultant, and they're there to do hand-holding. And there's actually this matrix in there on what they can be involved in and what they cannot be involved in, because they're not supposed to substitute. And essentially, it's everything except anything that involves a decision they're not supposed to be involved in. It's a very expensive model, and it's somewhat difficult to know how you draw the line, because often you have a consultant and the easiest thing for them to do is just to do it. And that is not necessarily consistent. So, we'll be evaluating that. But other things that we look at in terms of trying to find cost-effective ways of doing capacity building are sort of a buddy system with other procurement experts. The problem with capacity building is we normally think of it in terms of training, but just because you train someone in something doesn't mean they're going to do it. And that's when you need to look at the alignment of incentives. And often, and whether or not it's risk aversion or not, you can train someone till the cows come home. But if the incentives don't support it, they're not going to use that training. And then you'd have the retention issue. And I think the way you have to deal with that is almost through sheer volume of creating a pipeline of people who are qualified. And I think the way you do that is through things like university programs that build this kind of literacy, and hope over time that creates a critical mass. That may be among the most cost-effective ways of doing it, but I think cost of training, which is part of your calculation, I think is an important consideration.
Thanks. Sumi, I think you wanted to come in on, was it on the technology
On
point?
the E. I forgot to mention the important part of the E, which obviously I was reminded by Avinash. So you see how the merits of discussing in the same room with the auditors and the government. So on the E side, in the secretary, we call it under the diversity or the inclusive procurement rather than the E per se. Two aspects of the gender parity as well as the disability inclusion in the procurement process. And we are at the early stage, so we have not yet formalized that we are going to evaluate, which may not be the positive news of the procurement buyers group that we will actually be evaluating. But what we are discussing at the moment is that at least at the participation stage for the vendors, that we are going to recognize the bidders who actually made their capital investments and efforts on the disability inclusion and the women-owned entrepreneurship. So we do have a pilot project we already have with some corporate players on identifying the women-owned entrepreneurs in not only for the participating and actually participating in the tender opportunities, but also getting the awards after the process. And we are evaluating how many different procurement offices actually have done that. In terms of the disability inclusion, this is another thing that we are taking our baby steps, but in a very definite step that we are looking at it from the two aspects. One is not only counting the bins of how many vendors or the bidders who participate are actually the disability inclusion companies, but we are also looking at the universal design at the stage of the specs writing stage, that whether the goods or the services that we are requiring for is incorporating the universal design concept and the accessibility considerations. So those are some slow steps, but definite E steps that we are taking at the moment, which will be formally as a part of the evaluation process of the procurement outcome soon.
Sounds like real progress there. Questions? Yes, and then over here, there.
I think, in Karan Nagpal.
I know who you are, but can you remind yourself?
Yes. Karan Nagpal ID Inside. I think one, to Abhinash's point about using technology and IT, I think in a lot of our work with governments, I think one of the other challenges that has come up is procuring technology and procuring tech products. Obamacare's crash, the website crash on day one is a great canonical example that many governments have faced, which is the fact that technology, a bit like consulting services, is very hard to define before you start the work what that app or website is going to look like and what problems it's going to do. And so, we've had amusing stories of governments using philanthropic capital to hire ID Insight to manage the tech company that they had procured through their processes, and the tech company said, look, in the initial specs document, the button was going to do this, and now the button can only do this, and we don't care what the government wants today. We don't care why the users have pressed that button and the button is not working, but our job was to build the button. The button is built now, so you have to pay us. But the button doesn't work. So it'll be interesting to hear from your perspectives on what the UN system and governments are doing about tech procurement. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Samuel from Nauru. I have a couple of questions and comments. I'm just wondering what is their view if otherwise there are 3 donors, main donors, co-financing for one project, development project per country. What happened to the procurement? And the harmonizing is it's good, but maybe not possible. But perhaps we should have a standardized requirement, like 3 quotes and whatnot. And other comment also is that we need, especially for my country, we're very small and limited capacity, we need flexibility on procurement requirement. I have couple of examples, like when we have missing delivery docket, although the items is there, it's ineligible, right? So my government have to return the money. And especially with like this corporation, they did all the process, all the procurement process, and it was accepted by the donor, but they needed more to buy more product. So they went ahead without the process because they believe the supplier they're currently working with, it's the same supplier, they've already gone through the process. But they said ineligible, you have to bring back the money. Those kind of flexibility I want to share, because especially with small country in the Pacific, we have very limited knowledge. And also, especially on procurement for service contract, although we don't have that, we use like a recognized, or maybe ADB or something that can recommend a portal where we can advertise there, and then we do it's a recognized portal that to share, do the tendering advertisement for the procurement of contract. Thank you.
Thank you. Katia Sidiaki-Narivia from the UNESCO Evaluation Office. I have 2 questions, actually. My first question is, given that many of us are in search for evaluation services, particularly in countries that may not have very developed regional or national evaluation networks, I'm wondering if you can share any experiences that you may have had in overcoming that challenge of procuring evaluation services. So how do you go about ensuring that potential evaluators, see the call for services? So maybe I'm going a little bit off topic as to what has been discussed up to now, but this is really something, it's a challenge for us that we face. And my second question is about, you mentioned several studies, evaluations that have looked at procurement practices within your respective organizations, and I'm wondering if any of them have looked at the UN Global Marketplace and whether there have been any findings with how effective that system is. Thank you.
No, thanks. So I think we'll have to stop there, and let me just take the one question from the gentleman in Nauru on co-financing. And basically, the donors actually work well if it's pooled financing, in which all the money is in one pot. Then there's a lead donor, and the procurement of that donor system will be followed. But if it's parallel financing and it's just coordinated, then usually it's separate procurement practices. Okay, turn to the panel for some of the other more difficult questions. Sumi, over to you first.
Yes, let me just pick up that co-financing element. In terms of the UN Secretariat application, we have this situation where we are currently working under the development reform. How do we do the common procurement when there's a donor, from the assessed contribution coming from the Secretariat member states and also from the donor country to the particular project under a UNESCO, for example. How do we do it, right? So what we are discussing at this moment when it comes to the mutual recognition or the common procurement baseline is that if we are doing a lead procurement entity on behalf of 10 other UN system entities, common procurement, we follow the regulations or rules or procurement procedures of the leading entity. when we are doing on behalf of a entity under that particular donor of that project, then even if the procurement service provider is, let's say, UNSCOP, we will follow the recipient entities procurement practices and procedures of that, so that at least the collective multiple stakeholders have the one baseline to assess it. What that requires is of more harmonized, again, we will not be at the utopian world of one, one rule, but at least more and more of the processes and internal procedures, is it really value adding? And is it really necessary for having those variances across the UN common system? And I think that connects to the UN global marketplace. I'm so happy that you brought it up, because there are about, I'm losing the numbers, but there are about 29 UN system entities actually the members of the UN global marketplace, which it took its inception, where we wanted all of the companies not to be lost when they want to participate in World Bank, ADB, or UNESCO, or UN Secretariat, trying to look for where they can start the process. So UN Global Marketplace is actually the portal, which we also went through the reform processes for several years, and it's actually at the HLCM, and the procurement network discussions at the moment as to what I earlier mentioned, where do we find all these contracts? Where do we find all these tender opportunities? And that's the latest reform that we are working on, to create this repository where any members, the member states, auditors can actually look at it at the UNGM to have this best practices portal.
Thanks. Avinash, especially on the question on technology, procuring technology.
Yeah, actually, going to respond to that. So it's actually about the expected outcome and the realized outcome. That is what you. So once you procure, you will not leave it at that. So there is certain amount of the quality which you require. You have specified that. So even in case of technologies, the specifications of and the requirements to which you want the product to be, that is already to be specified in the RFP document, and the payment procedures are linked to the fulfillment of those requirements. If it is not, then you can actually withhold the payment and actually ask them to build the required amount specified in the RFP. And if it is not, then the RFP is substandard. So it has to be actually dealt at the beginning, and you have to actually closely monitor the entire process. Can't lose just giving out the contract without monitoring the contract, which is a very, very important part. Contract management is like we are planning for failure. So so the end result, we should not be surprised if we are not monitoring. Coming on to yeah. So with regard to the kind of combined Samuel just asked, is like even in the government parlance, the same applies. If you have more than two bidders, one is will be the lead one, the lead company, and the others will follow the suit. So the responsibility and the accountability of providing the service or the goods lies with the lead member. So all the like legal things will be borne by the lead member, and others will be under the lead member, however they want to contract it within themselves. So that is with regard to, and with regard to the challenges, yeah, about UNESCO. So that is actually I do not have direct kind of UN procurement process, but actually this can be to some extent met through better advertisement of the procurement. Generally, even in government, what we do is at various levels we try to, first is like you do it through the e-procurement platform. that is compulsory, that is e-GEM or e-CPP portal we say. So there may be other portal which is for UN systems. So one is that, then putting it on the website, and then we also do what is like the potential bidders, about 200 plus, we email them separately. Then also advertising them at various platforms. Second, so that is, so more you have to like more and more go public to find actually the bidders, large number of bidders. Otherwise it's we generally have seen, even after reaching out to 300 plus potential bidders, we receive 10, 15, 20, and it depends on the kind of nature of work, your goods or services. And thirdly, most importantly, individuals also you can hire, not only the firm, but also the individuals for smaller assignments or something. They are like bit easier to like kind of procure through a contract. So that can also be explored. Yeah.
Thanks. Jeff, any reflections on the questions, but especially on this procuring evaluation services in difficult areas?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the emerging findings in our evaluation is the importance of upfront market analysis. And that's usually been restricted to higher value contracts. There's a whole series of case studies, and it's found that without doing the analysis, often they'll issue the tender and they won't get any bidders, and then they'll have to start the whole thing over again. Had they done the analysis up front, perhaps they could have confronted that. But the getting back to the point about prioritizing critical procurement rather than high value, it's also important to do the market analysis on that, because some of the case studies will show that they can't find any of the services, the consultants that they want, and that delays the whole thing. Had they done the market analysis up front, they might have cast something differently. And so maybe that's one way of looking at the issue of acquiring evaluation services.
In conferences like these that get the word out. Well, we've had a very engaging conversation on a very important topic, and thank you to the panel for making it as lively as you have. So please join me in a round of applause for our panelists.